In times when Paul Harvey was too ill to record his broadcasts, he turned that responsibility over to the creator and sole writer of The Rest of the Story, a man he affectionately called Young Paul. Here's Paul Harvey Jr.
Now, the rest of the story. It happened once upon a winter time. The air was cool and clear, the tall pine forests were not yet blanketed in white, and it was on this country estate that a certain teenager would spend his Christmas holiday. He was 18, uncomfortably straddling the abyss which separates boyhood from manhood. He had not been doing well in school, though such frustrations would be set aside for the while. Mother was in the house. He and his cousin and younger brother were playing outdoors. Their game was called Fox and Rabbit. The 18-year-old, as eldest and fastest, would play the rabbit. The youngsters had been hunting him for 20 minutes or so. To avoid capture, he ran off through the woods, heading for the old bridge. Now, this bridge was a rustic, rugged structure some 50 yards long. It crossed a deep, dry ravine. The boy was halfway across and completely out of breath when he heard his young pursuers approaching from either side. He, the rabbit in their game, was trapped. Well, looking over the bridge rail, he could see the tops of the young fir trees which were growing in the ravine. Perhaps he could leap onto one of those trees and slide down it like a fireman's pole. Surely the branches would break his fall. So, judging the distance to the nearest treetop, he climbed over the rail, spread his arms wide, and jumped. But the boy had miscalculated. Merely brushing the outer branches, he fell 29 feet to the hard ravine bottom, where he lay unconscious and seriously injured. So what had begun as a children's game now threatened to end in tragedy. Well, Mother was alerted, and her son, still unconscious, was carefully lifted from the ravine and carried to his bed. Attended by the finest available specialists, he would remain unconscious for 3 days. And even as he awakened, his troubles were only beginning. Among his injuries, one kidney was ruptured. An operation would be required at once, and after that, months of recuperative confinement to his bed. His convalescence would take most of a year. When he was fit to travel, his parents brought him to London. And it was there that the boy's hitherto directionless life found its course. Restricted from vigorous activity, he now found the time to study, ultimately passing the school examinations he had twice failed before. He also found time to visit Parliament. And with each parliamentary session he observed, he became more and more interested in politics. Once aimless and uninspired, he was now turned on, and for the rest of his life he would stay that way. He graduated Sandhurst, the Royal Military College, 20th in a class of 130. At 20 years old, he joined the Army Cavalry, served abroad, distinguished himself as a soldier and a journalist. You see, his 18th Christmas holiday might have been his last. But instead, after the fall from that bridge, after 3 days unconscious, he awakened to become Winston Churchill. Only now, you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. It's hard to imagine a world in which Winston Churchill was anything but the British Prime Minister during World War II. His predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, had a foreign policy of appeasement and signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, which ceded the German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia to Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. If someone not as steadfast as Winston had become Prime Minister during the war, it's possible that the Allied forces could have lost the war. Rather than English, our dominant language could have been German, maybe Japanese. The horrors that would have unfolded are unimaginable, unfathomable. Winston Churchill was born in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire into the wealthy, aristocratic Spencer family. Now remember Lady Diana, Princess Diana? Her last name was Spencer. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was an elected member of Parliament. Winston was a descendant of John Churchill, who won many successful military campaigns in Europe for Queen Anne. That was about 200 years earlier. Winston's mother, Jenny, was the daughter of John Jerome, a wealthy financier from Brooklyn, New York. The Jeromes fought in George Washington's armies against the British during the American Revolution. Winston adored his parents, but the feelings were not reciprocated. Lord Randolph often expressed his harsh disappointment in young Winston. Winston's mother, Jenny, adored her children, but put her social role alongside her husband above everything else, including her children. Due to her perceived importance in the role, Winston often spent holidays apart from his parents, and they often went on long trips without him. Of his mother, Winston said, "She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." Winston was largely raised by Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, the nanny Winston affectionately called Woomany. Mrs. Everest was his constant companion during his childhood. They wrote to each other regularly when he was away at school. Winston later said that she was his confidant. "Mrs. Everest, it was who looked after me and tended all my wants. It was to her that I poured out all of my many troubles." When he heard that Mrs. Everest was gravely ill, he rushed to be with her. He was the only member of the family to visit her before she died. Upon her death, Winston paid for her burial and tombstone. Winston said, "She had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole 20 years I had lived. I shall never know such a friend again." In 1892, Winston and his family stayed with his aunt, Lady Wimborne, at Branksome Dean at Bournemouth, a coastal resort town in the south of England. This is Lady Wimborne's house. Wow. After a complete renovation which took a little over 2 years, Lady Wimborne's estate was transformed into a residential care home for older Freemasons. It opened in 1982 and is now known as Zetland. They specialize in dementia care. Winston described his aunt's estate in his autobiography, My Early Life, as being 40 or 50 acres of pine forest descended by sand undulations terminating in cliffs to the smooth beach of the English Channel. It was a small, wild place, and through the middle there fell to the sea level a deep cleft called a chine. 18-year-old Winston was the rabbit in the fox and rabbit game, being chased by his 12-year-old brother and 14-year-old cousin. Winston ran onto what he described as a rustic bridge nearly 50 yards along across the chine. Arrived at its center, I saw to my consternation that the pursuers had divided their forces. One stood at each end of the bridge. Capture seemed certain. But in a flash, there came across me a great project. The chine which the bridge spanned was full of young fir trees. Their slender tops reached to the level of the footway. Would it not be possible to leap onto one of them and slip down to the pole-like stem, breaking off each tier of branches as one descended until the fall was broken? I looked at it, computed it, I meditated. Meanwhile, I climbed over the balustrade. My young pursuers stood wonderstruck at either end of the bridge. To plunge or not to plunge, that was the question. In a second, I had plunged, throwing out my arms to embrace the summit of the fir trees. The argument was correct. The data were absolutely wrong. It was 3 days before I regained consciousness and more than 3 months before I crawled from my bed. The measured fall was 29 feet on to hard ground. Winston said he survived his injuries only due to the incredible, no-expense-spared health care his parents got for him in London. Winston failed to specify which of the chines, Branksome Dean chine or alum chine, was the location of the accident. Historians have argued their case for each of the two chines for decades, and the debate is ongoing. Both bridges were about the same length and height. Neither of the old rustic chine bridges exist today. Both bridges were replaced in the 1920s with stronger steel and concrete structures. I want to go out on a tangent for just a second, so please bear with me. I want to point out something in the photo of the Branksome-Dean chine. The Branksome-Dean chine photo is a stereoscope photo. The stereoscope is a device which was created in 1832 and made popular during the Victorian era. The stereoscope allowed a one-dimensional picture to appear in 3 dimensions. The specially created photo contained left eye and right eye views of the same image. For more than 80 years, the stereoscope was the popular form of home entertainment. This was the height of technology. People purchased special stereoscope cameras to produce their own stereoscope photos. The design of the stereoscope has evolved through the years, and you may have one in your home. The Viewmaster is a stereoscope which has been a popular toy since the 1950s. I remember playing with mine in the 1970s and 80s. The pictures were fantastic when you saw them in 3D. Does that sound bring back a good memory for some of you? Well, now virtual reality headsets used in video games today also descended from the Victorian stereoscopes. Looking back at the photos of Allen chine and Branksome-Dean chine, it's amazing that Winston Churchill survived regardless of which chine bridge he jumped from. Although Winston's mother and father left something to be desired as parents, we should thank them for the spare and no expense health care they provided for Winston after his accident. Had Winston Churchill not survived, our lives might be drastically different. Can you imagine? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.